And you're
And
good.
now I'm going to screen share again. It says I'm screen sharing. What am I sharing?
And you are recording too.
Good. That's always fun. Okay, and you can see my screen, right? Tyler, can you see the screen? Oh, sorry. Tyler?
Yep, we can see you.
You can
And
see me. Can you see the screen?
And the screen. Yep, you're good.
All right, we're good. Thank you, sir. Let me start my screen share then. Slideshow won't start. Hang on. I'm going to find this, fix it. Let's try this. Share that one. I think I'm finally there. So it's good to be back with you, and thanks for signing on tonight. And we're still going to be talking about the world in the New Testament tonight, but we're going to be talking about it in a little bit different way. Instead of just trying to introduce you to different parts of the world behind the text of the New Testament, I want to talk with you about connecting some of the parts that we have already talked about. First with the Gospel of Matthew, I'm going to do that tonight. And then with the Gospel of John, I'm going to do that next Monday night. So 3 weeks ago, I introduced you to the world of literature from the intertestamental period in the 1st century, and we found out it is a big world. But does any of it really connect with the Gospel of Matthew? And if so, how does it connect? Let me start off with a story. When I was in seminary, I had an Old Testament professor who challenged all of us to find as many ways as we could that the Gospel of Matthew uses something, anything, from the Old Testament. He said, you know, there's so many people that think that the New Testament is really all that you need to study. And he challenged us. He said, you know, as an Old Testament prof, I think I see a number of ways that Matthew makes use of the Old Testament. Go out and see how many you can find. And he promised that he would give an A in this exercise to the person who found the most. In a minute, I'll tell you who won and how. But right now, let me just ask you. If somebody asked you that question, asked you to do that, to find as many ways as you could that the Gospel of Matthew uses something, anything from the Old Testament, how would you try and go about doing that? Well, maybe you would start with the quotations. And it ought to be easy enough to find places where there are quotes around a passage that is an Old Testament passage, right? If you did that in different English Bibles, as I found out when some of my classmates had different English translations than I did, that there are different numbers in different English translations of the Bible, different numbers of quotes. Why? Because quotations, it turns out, aren't always easy to define. So then where would you go? Well, how about some places, after you've found as many quotations as you can, how about some places where Matthew might be alluding in some way to something in the Old Testament, kind of hinting at it or alluding at it, okay? Found some of those. Then maybe you would know something about what is called typology, places where Matthew seems to compare or contrast two things, and one of those things comes from the Old Testament. Good idea. Or maybe you'd read through Matthew and mark all the times where something Matthew seems to kind of echo something that you've read somewhere in the Old Testament. All right. That's a lot of ways that Matthew can use the Old Testament. And tonight I want to be truthful with you and tell you that Jim did not win that contest. The person who won found over 200 places where he thought Matthew made use of something from the Old Testament, a quotation or a paraphrase or an allusion or an echo or a piece of typology. And he had found a couple hundred of those places. I've forgotten the exact number. And he went into class and he was so proud of himself. And he saw the Old Testament professor and showed him what he had done. The Old Testament professor declared he was the winner of the contest. He would receive an A. And then he told the student that he'd missed about a third of the times where Matthew uses the Old Testament. So he began to explain to us something called intertextuality. Intertextuality. And I'm going to talk with you tonight about three things. About part of the literature that comes from the world behind the New Testament. And that's what we call today the Old Testament, which was still being developed. It was not yet a canon of agreed books, and its text was a little bit flexible, but in general terms, the books of Moses and the prophets were recognized as being authoritative at the time that Matthew was writing. So I want to look particularly at that part of the literature of the world behind the text. I want to relate it to the Gospel of Matthew and show you how it connects. And I want to do that through a tool called intertextuality. One of the most distinctive, recognizable features in the Gospel according to Matthew is, of course, you knew, the extensive use that it makes of what Christians call today the Old Testament. Judaism calls this the Hebrew Bible, or it's known as the Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K in transliteration, as you move those Hebrew letters over into English letters, the Tanakh. And Tanakh is actually an acronym. The three consonants are T and N and K. T is the first letter of the Hebrew word Torah. N is the first letter of the Hebrew word Nevi'im. And K is the first letter of the Hebrew word Ketuvim. Torah is the law, what we call the law. Nevi'im are the prophets. And Ketuvim are the writings. And you can see the names listed there. And once again, I'll put these slides up for you. And I'll also include my lecture notes from tonight. And this is the way that many Jewish people in our day would refer to what we call the Old Testament. They would say, oh, you mean the Tanakh. It's clear, not only from the number of times that Matthew draws upon the Tanakh as he writes, but from the different ways that he does that Matthew finds enormous meaning and significance in connecting Jesus' life and ministry to the Old Testament. And I'm going to keep using that phrase Old Testament now that I've told you what I mean by it. As we start to think about that, the literary world behind the text and how Matthew uses part of that world in writing his gospel, let's see how that works by starting to think about it in relationship to Matthew chapter 13. You know, Tyler preached a great sermon last Sunday on the Beatitudes. And congratulations, Tyler. I thought you did a great job. But as he pointed out, there are more than just the Beatitudes that most Christians know about, the ones that come out of the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, the word beatitude occurs in a number of different places in the New Testament, as well as the concept of being happy, and in that sense, being blessed or fortunate in Matthew 13. In Matthew 13, there's a beatitude. What is it? Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and in the New Revised Standard Version translation, here's what he says to them. This is the beatitude, the blessing that he pronounces over them. It reads like this: "But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Truly, I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but didn't see it, and to hear what you hear, but didn't hear it." Now, in context, Jesus speaks those words, that beatitude, in a context in which he has been teaching the crowds a parable about a sower and some seeds and some different kinds of soil. And the crowds don't understand the point of his parable. So Jesus' disciples come to him and they ask, "Why do you always speak to them in parables?" And Jesus replies, "To you it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it's not been given. For to those who have, more will be given, and they'll have abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. The reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, you will indeed listen, but never understand. You will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes so they might not look with their eyes, or listen with their ears, or understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them." And then Jesus pronounces that beatitude over his disciples. "But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but didn't see it, and to hear what you hear, but didn't hear it." And here's a contemporary picture of Jesus teaching his disciples those words to you. Although Jesus' blessing, his beatitude, was first spoken over the 12, Matthew clearly understands and intends for us as his readers, the readers of his gospel, to understand that beatitude, Jesus' beatitude, as a blessing for all Christ followers who hear and read Jesus' words. All those who, as Jesus says, understand with your heart. How do you understand with your heart? How do you listen with your heart so that you understand? Well, by turning in repentance and faith to Jesus and understanding this parable is not just a funny story. Funny because, after all, what the sower wastes is most of his seed by throwing it in places where it doesn't sprout or grow or produce. No, those who hear the parable and understand with their heart perceive that Jesus is asking them to become good soil that receives the seed he wants to plant in them through his word. Good soil that begins by placing faith in Jesus Christ and allowing that faith to grow into a relationship with Jesus that produces a crop of greater faith and a greater knowledge of the kingdom of God and the one who brings the good news of the kingdom. In Matthew's understanding, people like that are now disciples, followers of Christ, just like the 12. They are people whose hearts have understood, and they now understand not only the parables, but all of Jesus' teaching and how it connects with the Old Testament. And the question is, are you a disciple like that? Do you understand the connection between Jesus' words and the Old Testament? Here's a wonderful portrait that I like of the prophet Isaiah, looking up, and then he's going to write something when he looks down again. In Isaiah, God's words that Matthew paraphrases commission Isaiah, but they also explain to him in advance that his prophetic ministry is not going to be received by Israel. And the words of Jesus also explain to the 12 why he teaches the crowds in parables and they don't understand. But it goes further. It blesses them with the beatitude. Blessed are you, for your eyes see and your ears hear and you understand with your heart. In a way, Jesus says that Isaiah longed to see. So one text and context from Isaiah, where those words had meaning in his historical situation, is being used in another text and a different context, the text of Jesus' reply to his disciples in the text of Matthew, and it's being recontextualized. Recontextualized. Same words put in a different context and filled with even more meaning, as the meaning that came in the situation of Isaiah in the Old Testament, the meaning of this text that it had in reference to Isaiah's situation and his people is expanded now to include Jesus' ministry and the people that he teaches. And that is intertextuality. This is a great diagram for intertextuality. You can see that there's a book at the center, and it is receiving input from books all around it. Intertextuality is the way one text, a new text, uses another text, a text written before the first text. Or you can turn it around and say, it's the way one text, an older text, influences another text, a newer text, because the influence works both ways. Intertextuality, as we're going to see next, can work in more ways than by way of quotation and recontextualization, like it does in Matthew 13. Before we do that, though, here's a definition of intertextuality that tells you a lot more than the simple definition I just gave you. Intertextuality. Any writer is a reader of texts, or someone who knows something about other texts, before she or he creates their own text. And therefore, the work of art is inevitably shot through with references, quotations, and influences of every kind. Recontextualization is what we've seen so far in Matthew 13. And the way I like to think about recontextualization is this. If you know anything about art galleries, you know that even the galleries of the Louvre in Paris are rearranged from time to time. Why is that? Because people who come to the Louvre regularly get so used to seeing one painting in one particular order in one particular room that seeing it in a different order in a different room allows them to see something new in it. That painting has been recontextualized. And intertextuality does the same thing, not with a work of painted art, but with a work of literary art. That's intertextuality. Now, interestingly enough, the words that God speaks to Isaiah in the Old Testament in chapter 6 follow immediately after a parable that God's Spirit gives Isaiah to tell in his original historical context. The parable is recorded in chapter 5 of Isaiah. It's a parable about a vineyard where Judea and Jerusalem are the vines in the Lord's vineyard that God cares for, but they have failed to produce fruit. And the words of Jesus in Matthew 13 follow immediately after a parable. Parable, as I told you, about a sower and seeds and different kinds of soil. 3 soils fail to produce any fruit. But the 4th soil, the good soil, produces 30, 60, even 100 times, Jesus says. So I wonder, do you think Matthew understands the same parallels that I just pointed out to you? Does he listen when he remembers the words of Isaiah to the context of Isaiah as well, and understand that context with his heart and relate it to the similar parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 13? Is there an echo in Matthew's mind as he listens to Jesus of the context from Isaiah chapter 5, as well as the words that he quotes from Isaiah chapter 6? Maybe. In fact, most people believe probably. That's intertextuality. So perhaps in Matthew 13, there is intertextuality on top of intertextuality, double-decker intertextuality. I'll talk with you a little bit more about that and other kinds of intertextuality in just a minute. For now, though, let me say this. The Gospel according to Matthew quotes the Old Testament more than 60 times, no matter how you count. And that does not count allusions or echoes or paraphrases, but just those quotations. That's twice as many as any other account of the gospel in the New Testament. Twice as many. And the quotations are only the beginning of the way that Matthew uses the Old Testament text to tell you the story of Jesus and his ministry. Most people have heard or read at some time that Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels. And though some would say, including me, that the Gospel of John is also very Jewish, Matthew's Gospel is still very much a gospel influenced by Judaism. That influence is shown in several ways, but one of the most important is the way Matthew's Gospel consistently interacts and shows Jesus consistently interacting with what today we call the Old Testament. The Gospel of Matthew is influenced more considerably by what has come to be called Judaism and its influence than any of the other Gospels. And the word intertextuality is a blanket word that stands for all of the ways in which the influence of that text from the world behind the text of Matthew, the Old Testament, influences the form and the content of Matthew. To remind you again, intertextuality is the way the New Testament text makes use of another text, an earlier text. It can be from inside or outside the Old Testament. It can be used either directly in quotation or indirectly. And given that definition, in a very real sense, intertextuality is part of both the world behind the text of Matthew and the world inside the text of Matthew. So now in this part of our time together tonight, I want to talk with you about 6 ways that intertextuality takes place in the Gospel according to Matthew. And I want to give you examples that'll show you the connections between Matthew's text and texts from the Old Testament and outside the Old Testament. So 6 ways I want to talk with you about intertextuality. I'm going to list them for you, and then I'm going to move through them. I'll list them again at the end, and they'll be listed on the slides and on the manuscript copy of this that I'll put on the website. But here they are, 6 ways that intertextuality happens in Matthew. First, the way that we've talked about, quotation. Second, the word is called citation, and we'll learn in a moment how a citation differs from a quotation. Third is allusion. Fourth is echo. Fifth is type or typology. And 6th is what is called resonance. Resonance. 6 ways in which we're going to learn tonight that Matthew is indebted to the Old Testament, that the Christian gospel is indebted to the Old Covenant, the New Covenant indebted to the Old Covenant, and it shows up time and time again in Matthew's gospel. So to remind you what we've already said, quotation, you can define it like this in terms of intertextuality. There are the 6 kinds: quotation, citation, type, allusion, echo, resonance, right there on the slide for you. Quotation is when one writer uses the exact words from another writer, an earlier writer, a writer that is known to the person who's doing the writing, composing their written work. So Matthew does that in chapter 13, but intertextuality in the New Testament by way of quotation happens not only when New Testament authors quote the Old Testament, it also happens when the author of a New Testament text quotes any text. I won't choose an example from Matthew's gospel, but let me point out an example to you from the book of Acts, from Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17 is where Paul is in Athens, and he's speaking to the philosophers on the Areopagus in Athens. And if you go to visit Athens today, you can still see that place that rock where the Areopagus, and people would go to listen to what different philosophers said. And Paul had come to Athens teaching in the minds of the Athenians a different kind of philosophy. They wanted to hear more about that. So in Acts 17, Paul gave a teaching to them in a speech. And in the speech, Paul quoted a Greek poet. The Greek poet is named Epimenides. Epimenides lives around the year 600 BC. Epimenides, in his poem, one of his poems, writes about the immortality of the god that he knew as the supreme god, the god that we know as Zeus. And Epimenides said to Zeus in a poem and a prayer, "In thee we live and move and have our being." That phrase, that little line, gets quoted a lot. And usually if it's attributed to anyone, it's attributed to Paul. But if Paul were here today, being a well-educated diaspora Jew who grew up in Tarsus, as Paul says about the city of Tarsus, it was no mean city, no podunk place. He got a good education, not only in Judaism and Jewish customs and the Torah, but also in Greek writers. He quotes the words of Epimenides in his speech on the Areopagus in Athens. Let's talk now about citation. What's the difference between a quotation and a citation? Well, in our language, as we use those two words, we make them virtual synonyms, but there is a difference. A quotation uses the exact words. A citation uses almost the exact words. It paraphrases to a greater or lesser extent. Citation is where one writer paraphrases text from another writer. Paraphrases like that in terms of the Old Testament or the Tanakh were already being made before Matthew in early Second Temple Judaism. People oftentimes didn't quote the exact words that ended up in the Hebrew canon. There were a number of early paraphrastic translations, pardon me, of the Old Testament from Hebrew into languages like Aramaic or Syriac, for example. And in a very real sense, the Septuagint, we've talked about that several times in our course, the translation of the Hebrew into Greek is a paraphrase. Most of the quotations in the New Testament are paraphrased to some extent, and most of them look like they're taken from the Septuagint, although some reflect knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, or what we've come to know and call the Hebrew Bible. Why does that happen? Well, first, because Greek is the common language of the first century, like Tyler explained to you in his lecture about the history of the intertestamental period. Greek becomes the common language, not only of Alexander's empire, but of the Roman Empire that follows it. And second, because Greek was the most familiar language in diaspora Judaism, and most scholars believe that in the diaspora in the first century, the population was greater than the population in the Roman province of Palestine. Here's an example of a citation in the Gospel of Matthew. This one comes from Matthew 12 in verses 18 through 21. And the citation is from Isaiah again. I'm really trying to draw on Isaiah for Tyler's benefit tonight. But this citation is from Isaiah 42, and the quotation as Matthew has it reads like this: "Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him. He will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick." But Matthew's citation paraphrases and leaves off part of Isaiah 42. It doesn't match the exact words of either the Hebrew text or the Septuagint text, for that matter. It doesn't match any form that we know that's come down to us. So it's pretty clear that in Matthew chapter 12, these words are a paraphrase, which could have been from a text that he had known that we don't now have, or they could have been his own paraphrase from memory. In the book of Jude is another example, the little book toward the end of the New Testament. You've heard us refer to this a couple of times. In the book of Jude, the author cites a text that paraphrases closely material from the pseudepigrapha from the book of First Enoch, a Jewish apocalyptic text, a text talking about the end of the world that comes out of the intertestamental period. Jude warns his audience in verse 4 not to be like men who ignore the coming judgment that awaits, and he says, ungodly people who pervert the grace of God into license and deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. And later, in verses 14 and 15, Jude writes, it was about these men that Enoch in the 7th century from Adam prophesied, saying, see, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment. Well, those are a paraphrase of the words of First Enoch. They are not an exact word-for-word quotation. You can see, though, that there's certainly a paraphrase or a citation. Let me tell you about another kind. Oh, there are the words of First Enoch. I actually put that on a slide. Good for me. Here are the words of First Enoch. Take a look at them. And if you wonder why anybody would write in the name of Enoch in the pseudepigrapha, it's because of the quotation that's down there on the bottom right from Genesis. Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, for God took him. So if you're a writer in the intertestamental period who wants to talk from the perspective of someone that God loved and that obviously knew a lot about God's ways, and maybe even knew about how God was going to bring the present world into judgment and bring a new world into existence. If you were someone who thought that's what God wanted to do in the intertestamental period, you might take up the pen name of Enoch and write what you believe Enoch would say to your generation. And these would be his words. And Jude evidently knows about this paraphrase of Enoch. And he may or may not believe that it comes from Enoch. But it's paraphrased in the New Testament in the book of Jude. We've talked about quotation. We've talked about citation, paraphrase. Let's talk about allusion now. Matthew uses a lot of allusions to the Old Testament. Quotation and citation are relatively direct connections between Matthew and the Old Testament. Allusion begins to get us into a different area where the connection is more indirect. An allusion is an indirect quotation, some words, a phrase, a sentence or two, something that makes an indirect connection that brings to mind a text, since we're looking at the Old Testament, from the Old Testament or from another writer before Matthew. It's something that Matthew uses to bring to mind to you, his reader or listener, he hopes, a text from another writer. Let's take a look at an allusion. Matthew says in Matthew 23, actually Matthew records Jesus as saying, in Jesus' discourse about the end of the age, therefore I send you prophets and sages and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you'll flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. I once taught a class, New Testament class in the Gospel of Matthew, and I asked the folks that I was teaching if they knew any way in which the words of Jesus related back to the Old Testament. One person stuck up their hand and said, oh yeah, Abel, he was the guy that Cain killed, right? And I said, right, in the book of Genesis, you're one for one. Another person stuck up their hand and said, Zechariah, is this Zechariah the Zechariah that is one of the minor prophets? I said, congratulations, you've got it right. Did you know that he was the son of Berechiah? No, they said, I didn't know that. Did you know that he got murdered between the sanctuary and the altar? No, the guy said, I didn't know that. I said, you need to read the book of Zechariah over again. Jesus says, truly, I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. And you miss Jesus' point unless you know thoroughly the story of Cain and why his blood is called righteous, and you know the story of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, and why he also is murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. You miss what Jesus is trying to say. Truly, I tell you, all this that I just told you about will come upon this generation. How? Why? What way? You need to know the Old Testament to know the answer. We talked about 3 of the 6 so far. We talked about quotation, exact words. We talked about citation, paraphrases. We just talked about allusions back to the Old Testament, indirect connection that brings something to mind through words or phrases. Now I want to talk to you about an echo. If allusion is an indirect connection that Matthew wants you to make between what he writes and the Old Testament, then an echo is an even more indirect, even more implicit connection that Matthew hopes will bring to mind to you a text from another writer. In our case tonight, as we're thinking about this, another writer from what we call the Old Testament. So let's take a look at this. On the right is a truly memorable illustration of Jesus' crucifixion. And on the left are some words that come from 2 famous Matthean Gospel of Matthew New Testament scholars, W.D. Davies and Dale C. Allison. And both of them wrote a commentary together on the Gospel according to Matthew. It's 3 big 1,000-page volumes in length. Both of them, probably 2 of the best New Testament scholars with respect to Matthew in their generation. Both of them see an echo of Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2 in the phrase in Matthew 27:45 that you can read on your screens. Both of them believe that when Matthew uses this phraseology in describing what happened at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, that he is not only describing physically what happened, but he is making a connection between that physical event and the darkness that covered the face of the deep before God spoke and the world existed. The primordial darkness invaded, Matthew says, that moment when Jesus was crucified. That's an echo. An echo is more elusive than an allusion. It's more indirect, it's more implicit. But I'm sure you can see, even from just this one example, that echoes and allusions are sometimes hard to sort apart. But you can see how Matthew makes use of both of them from the examples that I've given you. And I'm just trying to finish in an hour and give you one example for each of the 6 ways that Matthew uses the Old Testament. Here's another example. And this one is a little tougher to tell whether it's an allusion or an echo. It comes from Matthew chapter 1. And when I showed this slide to my wife, Carolyn, she said, that's the best slide. So you know which one Carolyn thinks is the best slide. This is the family tree, the family genealogy of Jesus, who is called Christ. And it begins up at the top, really small words, but you'll see them better when you look at them on your computer. And it begins with 3 letters, A-B-R. Then the second line is A-H-A-M. And the third line is was the. And the fourth line is Father. and it goes all the way down through Jesus' family tree. So I want to take an example of something that is kind of tough to tell whether it's an allusion or an echo. The example comes from Matthew chapter 1. You know the genealogy, at least you know it's there. You probably haven't read it. You probably haven't studied it because, genealogies are not that interesting, except this genealogy is. Because in this genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, there are 4 women, and they are named women. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. And the question is, why are women included in this genealogy? Now, ladies, don't get upset with me too quickly. The point is that culturally, genealogies are done exclusively with male names. It's an exception when a woman's name occurs in a genealogy. And as far as we know, there is no other genealogy that has 4 named women in it, but this one does. But that cultural custom does not prevent Matthew from including the names of these 4 women, or including the names of other women who are named in Matthew's telling of the gospel. Despite his culture, despite its patriarchy. So then the question becomes, okay, Matthew names women, but Jim, why not more famous women? If you're going to pick women out of the Old Testament and include them in Jesus' genealogy, then why not, for example, use the name Sarah alongside Abraham? Matthew obviously intends for those who hear or read the genealogy to see something in the stories of these 4 women in the Old Testament that to him is as important, or maybe even more important, than Sarah's story. And a very important part in Matthew's mind of the story about Jesus. And although there are other possibilities, the one that seems the clearest to most New Testament scholars, in answer to my question, why these 4 women, is the answer that connects all 4 of these women with non-Jewish backgrounds. Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah, a Hittite. She probably is a Hittite as well. Ruth is named in the Old Testament as a Moabite. Rahab is named in the Old Testament as a Canaanite. And Tamar, in Jewish traditions, at least some of them, is connected with a Canaanite background too. So by naming these 4 women who all have backgrounds outside Judaism, Matthew may well intend to echo the way the good news of God came to these women in the centuries before he wrote, and comes to other women in the story of the gospel, as well as men, through Emmanuel, God with us, all of us, women as well as men, non-Jewish people as well as Jewish people. And you remember, don't you, how if we want to use intertextuality, not talking about the world behind the text, if we want to use it in terms of the world inside the text of Matthew, you remember that at the end of Matthew's gospel, in chapter 28, there are words that are known as the Great Commission, right? And what do those words say? Go and make disciples of all nations. Interesting, isn't it? That Matthew would choose to begin his gospel with a genealogy which mentions nationalities beside Judaism, the most Jewish gospel in the New Testament in many people's minds. Includes a promise that the good news that Jesus preaches will reach all nations in the same way that God's good news reached individuals of different nations in the Old Testament. And again, you can find another Old Testament echo of the same idea in the prophet Isaiah. And you heard Tyler preach about that on more than one occasion. Isaiah's vision was that when the Messiah came, the nations would stream to Jerusalem to hear him. Let's talk now about a type, or about typology. Hang in there with me. We're talking about 6 ways the Old Testament is used in the Gospel of Matthew, 6 different ways in which it influences the way Matthew tells the story of Jesus. And if you begin to see these 6 ways, then you will understand the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament much better. Because without the Old Testament, friends, there would be no New Testament. There would be no New Testament. And for many people who read the New Testament and don't read the Old Testament, they don't perceive the connection, and their understanding of the New Testament is impoverished. So let's talk about type, or typology, another way in which the Old Testament is connected with the New Testament. A type, or an example of typology, an instance of typology, is an instance of a comparison or a contrast between a person, one person and another person, between one place and another place, between one event or another event in 2 different times, in the time of the world behind the text and in the time of the world inside the text. Typology says there's a parallel here between one person from the Old Testament and one person from the Gospel of Matthew, one place in the Old Testament and one place in the Gospel of Matthew, one event in the Old Testament and one event in the Gospel of Matthew. Even though they're in 2 different times, there are important parallels, comparisons, or important contrasts that you need to understand, or you won't understand either of the parts of the comparison or the contrast. So here's a way that you can think about typology. This is a good chart. You can see that this is a chart that charts some of the ways in which a typology is made between Adam and Jesus, and looks at the way in which they are alike and the ways in which they are different, comparisons and contrasts. This is mostly a contrastive chart. But you know that, for example, Paul talks about Jesus as a new Adam, and there are comparisons as well as contrasts that could be made. But you can read for yourself. I don't need to read through the chart for you, but you can see the ways in which 3 of the 5 things that are being contrasted on this chart have reference directly to the New Testament. We're going to talk about typology in relationship to the Gospel of Matthew. So you heard me mention the name of Dale Allison just a moment ago. Dale Allison, again, a very prominent Old Testament scholar, wrote a book, and the book was primarily about a Matthean typology, the way in which Matthew uses over and over and over again quotation, allusion, citation, echo, typology, and relates Moses to Jesus and Jesus to Moses. Why? Why would there be that much in the Gospel of Matthew? Well, because there is a likeness between Jesus and Moses. And in many ways, even though Jesus is not called a son of Moses, Jesus is portrayed in Matthew's Gospel again and again as being like Moses. Because of the likeness, Jewish writers and Gentiles with any knowledge of Judaism, Gentiles who might have been conversant with some Old Testament beliefs, are reminded again and again in the Gospel of Matthew of Moses, and especially of Moses' words in Deuteronomy chapter 18. Those words go like this. You see them on your screen. These are Moses' words now in Deuteronomy 18. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from among Israel. Him you shall hear. Just as you desired from the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly. Horeb is the place where the Lord's fire descended on the mountain and brought to Moses the 10 Commandments. But before Moses went up the mountain, the fire of God came down on the whole assembly of the people, and the whole assembly of people said, don't let us hear the voice of the Lord our God again, because it thundered, and don't let us see his great fire or we'll die. Moses says in Deuteronomy 18, when God heard that, the Lord said to me, all that they have said is right. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among the people of Israel. I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command. That word all is very important. We'll come back to it again at the end of tonight, but remember that word. I'll raise up a prophet like you from among the people of Israel. I'll put my words in his mouth. He shall speak to them all that I command. And whoever will not give heed to my words, that prophet will speak in my name. I myself will require it of them. Interesting words. In Judaism, before and after the time of Moses, during the time of Jesus as well as the time of Moses, many interpreted Moses to be speaking about the Messiah. They looked for a Messiah who would fulfill Moses' words, who would be like Moses. That makes parallels between Matthew's portrait of Jesus and the text of the Torah and its portrayal of Moses, an instance in the Gospel of Matthew of extended typology, extended comparison. Matthew wants you, as a reader or listener to his gospel, to understand that Jesus is the fulfillment of Moses' prophecy, that he is the prophet like Moses. So let me just run through some of these comparisons that you find in the Gospel of Matthew. You see the first one in front of you. In the Old Testament, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, killed all the baby boys, and only Moses was saved, right? Yeah. Well, in the New Testament, Herod is the king of Israel. He also kills all the baby boys, and only Jesus is saved. Great. That's one, Jim. Let's take that one in. Here's another one. When Moses leaves Egypt, when he flees Egypt, when he comes out of Egypt, he lives in Midian for 40 years before his ministry begins. Jesus flees from Herod down into Egypt and moves out of Egypt with his parents after Herod dies, lives in Nazareth 30 years before his ministry begins. Well, not an exact parallel, Jim, but I can see what you mean. Give me another one. Here's another one. God leads Moses and Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness. In the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, where does God's Spirit lead Jesus after his baptism? Into the wilderness, right? So Jesus, like Moses and the people of Israel, before they enter into what God promises them and before they are able to fully respond to that call, Jesus is led by God's Spirit to be tempted into the wilderness, in the same way that Israel was tempted in the wilderness. Give me another one, Jim. Okay. Moses goes up a mountain, like I told you a moment ago, and he comes back down the mountain and he teaches the 10 Commandments, the Torah, the law. In the Gospel of Matthew, where does Jesus go after his baptism and temptation? His temptation happens in chapter 4 of Matthew. Where does he go? He goes up a mountain and he sits down and teaches not 10 commandments, but 9 beatitudes. And what does he call those 9 beatitudes? He calls them the fulfillment of the law. Think not, he says, that I have come to abolish the law, the Torah, and the prophets, the Nevi'im. I have not come to abolish them. I've come to fulfill them, to fill up their meaning, to show you what they really mean. Here's another comparison between Moses and Jesus that's found in the Gospel of Matthew. The spoken words of Moses are collected in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible in 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Well, the spoken words of Jesus are collected in the Gospel of Matthew, in the world inside the text, in 5 discourses. Now, older scholarship used to say, is this a conscious parallel by Matthew, or is it unconscious? Are Jesus' 5 discourses Jesus' new law? No, probably not Jesus' new law, But it is significant that Matthew does want you to make, and New Testament scholarship still sees the connection between the 5 books of the law in the Old Testament and the 5 major discourses. The first of those discourses we call a Sermon on the Mount. There are 4 others in the Gospel of Matthew. Moses' teaching is found in 5 books. Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Matthew is found in five monologues, 5 extended passages of teaching, 5 discourses. All right. Let's talk about the last kind of intertextuality. Thank you for staying with me. The last kind of intertextuality I want to talk with you about is called a resonance. And resonance works from any of the other 5 kinds of intertextuality that I've talked with you about tonight. That's why I've saved it for last. A resonance evokes, E-V-O-K-E-S. A resonance evokes a connection. And the connection is between the mind of a reader and the text. And the resonance may or may not have ever been thought of by the writer of the text. Allusion, echo, typology. In some sense, New Testament scholars can see that Matthew could have and might very probably, or at least perhaps, have been thinking himself of the connection. But a resonance is a connection that you make as a reader from the world in front of the text. You make the connection on the basis of what you see the text saying, and it seems that it may be a connection that Matthew makes, or maybe it's just a connection that you're making and you can't quite figure out which one it is. That's a resonance. But you see the connection, you pass it on. Maybe you pass it on as a comment in a Bible study. Maybe you pass it on as a comment to your pastor. Maybe you pass it on as a comment to your friend. It's a resonance. The text resonated with you in some way. It resonated with your experience. I love this picture, don't you? This is a little boy who's listening with both ears. And sometimes when you listen with both ears, you hear a resonance. How does it happen? Well, maybe, for instance, you get in a conversation with someone and the conversation is about grace. And you say, you know, the words of John chapter 1, they've always meant a lot to me whenever I think about grace. You know the words, they say something like, from his fullness, we've all received grace upon grace. And you or someone that you're talking to, they say, yeah, except I never thought about that in relationship to the text that we've been talking about. That's a resonance. Or you might be reading along in John, and you come to another text in John, a text like the story of Jesus and the woman at the well in chapter 4 that I've talked with you about before. And even though you've read that story, I don't know, 5 or 10 times, all of a sudden when you're reading it this time, those words from John chapter 1, grace upon grace, they come back to your mind. For as you look at the way that Jesus graciously, repeatedly interacts with this woman, those words, grace upon grace, come back to your mind. And you might wonder, did John write those words in chapter 1, intending them to come back to me when I read chapter 4 and the story about Jesus and the woman at the well? Or is that just something that I see that maybe John didn't even intend? In any case, that's a second kind of resonance, a resonance between one text and another inside the same world of the same text, the Gospel of John. Or another time, you might be reading through the story of Genesis, and you see repeatedly in Genesis how God graciously keeps his covenant with Abraham, even when Abraham doubts that it's possible to be fulfilled, or even when Abraham does something that's obviously not what God intends him to do, like telling Pharaoh that Sarah's his sister when in fact Sarah's his wife. Even Pharaoh knows that's wrong. Anyway, suddenly the thought occurs to you as you're thinking about that story in the world behind the text. Suddenly that thought occurs to you. Is that grace upon grace showing up in the Old Testament? Is the text telling us the same fullness of grace that comes from Jesus in the New Testament that John writes about as coming through him in John 1:16? Is that same kind of grace upon grace coming through Yahweh in the book of Genesis? So when John writes about grace upon grace, is he perhaps thinking not only of Jesus, but of Yahweh? Is this a resonance that John intended, or am I the only one that's picking it up? See, resonance can happen in any of three ways. While quotation and citation and allusion, at least the clear allusions, and typology, again, at least the clear types, are forms of intertextuality that were certainly intended by the New Testament author, echoes, and especially resonances, may or may not have been connections intended by the New Testament author. For both echoes and resonances can take place, though I would say resonances more than echoes, without the New Testament author intending them, or even recognizing that they're present in the text that he writes. That difference between intended and unintended is important to consider. Think about it with me for a minute. Resonance can take place, it often does in Matthew, when he reads or remembers an Old Testament text that was not consciously intended by its Old Testament author to refer to Jesus, but intended to refer to a person or event in the Old Testament. However, Matthew, inspired by God's Spirit, remembers the Old Testament text, sees the connection between the Old Testament person, event, or word and Jesus' life in terms of something Jesus says or does, and recontextualizes the Old Testament text so the readers will see the same connection. In that way, the Old Testament is fulfilled. That's what fulfillment is, recontextualizing. Matthew sees something in the Old Testament that relates in some way to Jesus and his life and teaching, and he recontextualizes it. He takes it out of its Old Testament context, says that it fits in Jesus' life and ministry as a context, and its meaning is slightly different in the life and ministry of Jesus than it was in the Old Testament context. It may be very different, but Jesus' life and ministry fills up the meaning of that event or those words. Ever heard that word recontextualizing? This slide is an example of recontextualizing, like I explained to you. Here's an art gallery. This art gallery exists in New York. And when I found this picture, I found out that it is rearranged by the gallery owner at least once a month, because the gallery owner is trying to sell a painting, trying to get you to look at a painting, or trying, in this case, to get you to look at a piece of sculpture. You probably noticed it right away as soon as you saw the picture, didn't you? Because the piece of sculpture has been moved from the corner of the room, the back corner of this picture, into the middle of the room by the gallery owner in order to make you pay attention to it. And the gallery owner has turned it around so that you see the back of the sculpture as you enter the room. What does it do to you when you see the back of the sculpture? It makes you curious. What does the sculpture look like? I'm going to walk around it, look at it in different ways, and see what it's really all about. The gallery owner who put up this story in this picture said that in response to recontextualizing that statue, placing it in a different context in the room, the statue sold within a week. Matthew wants to recontextualize the Old Testament so that it will sell for you and me the connection between God's grace in the Old Testament and God's grace in the New Testament, so that it will sell the connection for you and me between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus. Matthew wants to recontextualize the Old Testament so that it will show us all of the connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament. For friends, although it was an early heresy in the early church to say that the Old Testament can be abandoned because we have the New Testament now, Matthew says exactly the opposite. And the better you and I know the Old Testament, the more we read it through, the more connections we will see between the Old Testament and the Gospel of Matthew. The more connections we will feel between the Jesus of the Gospel of Matthew, for whom the Bible was what we call the Old Testament, and the Jesus who speaks out of that context in order to fulfill the meaning of the Old Testament for us. Matthew recontextualizes, so that will happen for us. Now, I've been talking to you about resonances. This experience of having an older text in a Hebrew Bible resonate in the experience of someone reading it later, for example, not just Matthew, but anyone in the intertestamental period of the first century, it's not a new thing. There's evidence from Jewish literature in the Apocrypha, in the Pseudepigrapha, in the early rabbinic literature, particularly in some of the early rabbinic literature, and in the apocalyptic literature of writers, that parts of the Old Testament resonated for them in terms of how they came to understand and talk to the people through their literature about what was going to happen in the Messianic age, or what was going to happen at the end of the age when God judged the world. And there are examples of non-Messianic resonances in the New Testament too, in Paul's letters, for instance. In the book of Job, Job describes his suffering at one point as an imprisonment, as though he's in prison. In chapter 13 and verse 27, Job tells God, "You have placed my feet in stocks." And in one of his prison letters, one of the letters that he writes from a Roman prison, in the letter to the Colossians, Paul concludes his letter with these final words, last letters. "I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Remember my chains." Reading that, a contemporary reader might perceive a resonance between the two different kinds of imprisonment and think that perhaps, just maybe, when Paul wrote, "Remember my chains," he, like a good Jewish rabbi who knew the Old Testament much better than we do, who knew most of it by memory, had a text in Job in mind that had come back to him. I'll show you another slide. In the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, there is a man named Richard Hayes. He is Dr. Richard Hayes, Professor Richard Hayes, professor of New Testament at Duke Divinity School, and the former head of the dean of the Divinity School, the whole Divinity School. He's written several books. Here's a picture of one of them. This book is called Echoes of Scripture in the Four Gospels, and it goes much further into detail. I've only tried to give you one example or two from, and I've tried to pick all of them from the Gospel of Matthew and then shown you how other New Testament authors echo the Old Testament as well. But Richard Hayes does a far better job, for far more in-depth than I've been able to do tonight. Richard Hayes writes this about resonances. He says, if as Christians believe, and we do, the texts of the Old Testament and the New Testament are written not only out of the mind of a human author, but a human author inspired by God's Spirit, then isn't it also possible and perhaps even likely that Christian readers can perceive resonances in the text that have not been previously recognized? Richard Hayes thinks that it is. And in a speech that he delivered, in a teaching, in a presentation he made at the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas, that's introduced by the man who helped build the library. He's a lawyer and a Bible teacher in Houston. His name is Mark Lanier. In this video, I always encourage my students to watch at least 15 minutes of it. It's a little bit over an hour long. Richard Hayes talks about intertextuality in much more depth than I've been able to talk about it tonight. And you'll be able to pick up this internet link and click on it, perhaps from the slide when you get it from CKPC, or put it in your browser. And I would really encourage you to watch at least 15 minutes of his presentation on the echoes of Scripture in all four of the Gospels. Tonight, what I've tried to do with you is to enable you to understand what Jesus is really saying in the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know if Tyler's going to go on to talk about this, but I hope that he will. And maybe I can call him out and encourage him to do that. It's the text that I mentioned to you a couple of times. It comes from Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Those were the two parts of the Old Testament that by Jesus' day had come together, had the things in them that we believe and have in our Old Testament canon. Don't think that I've come to abolish those things, Jesus says. I have not come to abolish them. I've come to show you how they are meant to be fulfilled. And the question for all of us applicationally is, do we allow them to be fulfilled for us? Do we read our Old Testament enough in connection with our New Testament that we can find the quotations, the citations, the allusions, the types, the echoes, and even perhaps, if our mind is inspired by the Spirit, a notion that will come to us from out of the blue, like the one I mentioned to you a moment ago. I don't suspect that you've ever connected the story of Abraham and the grace upon grace that Abraham receives with the words of John in John chapter 1. From his grace we have all received, from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. I don't know if John intended that connection to be made, but I know that once it was made for me, it became one that I cannot escape. Every time I read the story of Abraham, I think about John's words in John chapter 1 and how Abraham experienced the same grace of God, God's undeserved favor, that in the New Testament you and I receive as well in a fully filled up way through Jesus Christ. For Abraham experienced God's grace in his relationship with God. But in Jesus Christ, God's grace has been more fully filled up, as we know, through Jesus' death on the cross for our sins, and through his resurrection that promises us eternal life with him and with his Father and with the Spirit forever. So that's how I'll end our talk about making connections between the Gospel of Matthew and the world behind the text, making them between different parts of the Gospel of Matthew, the world inside the text, and making them with our own experience, the world in front of the text. And I hope it's been helpful to you. I'll turn you all back on now, I hope. Let's see if I can do that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Good. I'm going to go into participants. I'm going to unmute everybody. All right, you all are now able to be vocal. What do you think about this concept? This relating the Old Testament to the New Testament this closely, as Matthew seems to do. What do you think about that?
Good idea.
Good idea, I agree. You know, there was a reason why Tyler spent so much of this year talking about the book of Isaiah.
I appreciated that. The Isaiah shout outs and the Sermon on the Mount.
Yep.
You're doing my work for me. I love it.
No, I'm prepping them so they can get the good stuff from you later on. But you might think, oh gosh, it's only, New Testament scholars that should be concerned about six different kinds of intertextuality. And the word is actually a pretty new word. It was coined in 1967. It wasn't coined by any biblical scholar. It was coined by a woman in France who studied the connections between French literature and English literature. And she coined the word intertextuality. But since then, it's become a hugely important word for what we used to call, quotations or cross-references, we called them for a while. And there's so many different kinds when you stop to think about it. And once somebody turns you on to this, I guarantee you'll read through the Gospel of Matthew if you think about that concept, and you'll see them occur again and again and again. Matthew's Gospel is just shot through with them. What questions would you like to ask? I see a couple things here in chat. Let me see if I can pick up anything from that. No, they're just telling me that I finally succeeded in getting online. But come back to me. Let's have some discussion together tonight. What do you think about all this? Beside the fact it's a good thing.
Never know.
My wife's laughing at me. That could be a good sign when she's smiling.
I guess I have a question.
Good.
How long did it, well, Matthew was a tax collector.
Mm-hmm.
And this shows a lot of work putting together. How long did it take him to do this?
So different New Testament scholars have different views about the final editing of Matthew's gospel, but I would say the majority of New Testament scholars believe in some way that the material originates with the apostle that we call Matthew. In the early church, the quotation came from Papias, who's in the 4th century, and he gets from Eusebius in the 4th century. He gets his material from Papias, who's close to the time of the New Testament, relatively speaking. Papias has one sentence about how the Gospel of Matthew came to be. He says Matthew composed the logia, L-O-G-I-A, and that word in Greek means sayings, oracles, teachings of Jesus that he knew in his memory, in his Aramaic memory. He composed them, he arranged them, he put them together, he collected them, just like you said, Trish. And then everyone used them and made use of them as they were able. So it may be that the Gospel of Matthew originates because Matthew is a tax collector. He's used to organizing things. He's used to keeping tables of things. He's used to collecting things, records, and collecting them not only on paper like we think about or in an Excel spreadsheet today, because nobody uses paper anymore, right? But in their generation, paper is a relatively rare thing. And so you remember what someone has brought to you the last time they brought their taxes. It's kind of like, if you have a favorite person that you like to shop with and they remember what you like, or it's kind of like that. Matthew has a great memory, apparently. And so he collects in his memory, and maybe in writing as well, what Papias calls the logia of Jesus in Aramaic. And then everyone makes use of them as they're able. And there's a lot of logia in the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, the majority of the content of Matthew is made up of Jesus speaking in one way or another. Mm-hmm. In monologues, the 5 major discourses, in dialogues with people. But you can see the influence of the Apostle Matthew over the text of Matthew's Gospel. And yes, it's probably because he was a very organized person, had a good memory, and made use of the skill that he developed as a tax collector in collecting those and organizing those logia. Good question.
Hey, Jim, real quick, I'm wondering, would you be able to turn on screen sharing for me?
Sure.
Some people still silenced.
Okay.
Some people still silenced.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, I just pulled it back out of there. Did I lose it again, Tyler?
What's that?
Did I lose the screen sharing?
I meant, sorry, would you enable me screen sharing and click on participants?
Oh, okay. All right. Hang on a second. Let me get you to screen share. I hope I didn't. If not, I'm really good at this. The next morning, it's even clearer. I was never fond of nighttime classes. All right, manage participants. It won't let me open that. I'm pushing on manage participants.
Oh, no worries
there.
then.
Hold on a second. I see him. Hold on. He didn't come the first time. I must not have clicked hard enough. All right, let me see what I can do for you. More. Okay, so I've got stop, spotlight, make host, forbid record, rename, put in waiting room, remove, and report. I've got a microphone. I've got a camera.
So maybe not.
Oh, I got a record button. Hang on.
Do you have a allow screen share? It may not allow it, and that's okay.
Okay, I've got a record button. It's still going blinking red.
Okay, that's if you have your email pulled up, I'll send this to you, and if you don't get it, that's okay.
Okay. Are you thinking it needs to stop, or it may not have recorded?
Actually, Jim, if you just want to, it's not critical, but there's a really cool graphic. I don't know if it was Logos that put it out of all the Bible cross references. Have you seen that?
No, but well, or I may have, and I may have forgotten about it. I use Logos. You're right. All right, you sent it to me by email, and I put it up.
All right, sounds good.
All right.
Yeah, different people.
You using Tall Jim Davis at Gmail?
Yep, just sent it.
Okay, I'll refresh. Well, let's go into the Windward Islands before it comes to me, apparently. Just bouncing around the world. There we go. Oh, yeah, I have seen this one. Yeah, this is a cool diagram. Let me show you. Let me show everybody. I gotta share my screen. First, I gotta get it into my screen. All right. Come on. Now I can share my screen. Can you see that, everybody?
Yeah.
So this is actually, Logos is a Bible software program that enables you to do a whole bunch of things, but this is helping you to see connections between Old Testament and New Testament. And it's showing you in terms of color and in terms of there's a chart, a black and white chart at the bottom, and it's showing you all, just kind of portraying for you all of the different ways that the Old Testament connects with the New Testament. Right?
So that the far left is Genesis, and it's basically going by, I think, chapter length, and the far right would be Revelation, but it's showing all the ways that they're throughout Scripture, cross-referencing and intertextuality, and it's a lot.
It's a lot. In fact, I would wager say that no one has a full account of all of them, and part of that is the reason that is because there's a lot of overlap in some of the categories and things that one person would see as a connection, another person might not see. But this is it's a great graphic. Thank you for pointing it out to me.
I don't want to burst your bubble, but there was an atheist group put out a similar diagram, very similar to this, connecting all the inconsistencies in the Bible.
Sure. You could do that too.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the consistencies.
Yeah, that was also an interesting graphic.
Yep. No, I don't think you can burst the bubble any way you cut it or prick it. And I really do encourage you all to take a listen to the first 15 minutes of that lecture as well. He's a very engaging presenter. You will enjoy it, I guarantee you. All right, let me see if I can get rid of this now. Tyler's doing the screen sharing, so he'll have to stop. Let me see if I can stop it. There, now you're all back again. Thanks, Tyler.
Your students always this quiet?
Classes in seminary always this quiet? No, they're more boisterous, like Rich just was.
Was that? I wondered who that was.
They seek to go in a completely different direction than you would have gone, and point out something that's also true, or ask you a tough question they don't think you'll be able to answer, or something like that. Usually, question and answer time is stump the professor time.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have these really great ideas, and later I find out they were totally wrong. Is there any way to test these things that come to your mind?
You know, the way to test is going to be different for each of the 6 different kinds of intertextuality, Bob. You can text a quotation by looking at a cross-reference in a Bible, and you can see how closely it seems to match, but you'll be doing that in English translation. You can test an allusion by looking at a commentary on a particular from a particular author on Matthew, and see if the commentary mentions what you see as an allusion as well. Or you can just take the easiest path to find out whether it's truly an allusion, a citation, an echo, or anything else. You can just ask Tyler.
I'll do that.
It's so much fun, you know, coming back into CKPC and being able to talk with you and do some teaching like with all of you like this, like I do for Fuller. And at the same time, not be the pastor.
Myrna had a question for you on chat.
Yep.
Do you see your chat?
Chat, let me get down to chat.
There's some people that are still muted, and Myrna has a specific question.
Well, let me see. I thought I unmuted everybody.
I know. Go ahead and get the question out.
Does she have her microphone muted? She may.
Yeah.
Everything here says she's unmuted. Myrna, go ahead. She still has her microphone muted.
Yeah.
Do you see her question there, Jim?
Let me see.
You can just tell him, Tyler.
She said, are there Christian churches who discourage the study of the Old Testament?
I don't know of any Christian churches that actively discourage the study of the Old Testament. But I would say that there are a number of churches and a number of pastors who spend the vast majority of their time teaching, preaching the New Testament. And in that way, their congregations pick up the fact that most of the good stuff is in the New Testament. Now, you are very happy and very fortunate, both senses of the word makarios, to have a pastor like Tyler, because Tyler does not spend all his time in the New Testament, but he begins to show you the connections and how you really cannot understand the New Testament as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. You cannot understand it in the way that Jesus hopes you will understand it unless you read it knowing something about the Old Testament. So I want to encourage you. Actually, I'm going to challenge you. When was the last time you read through the Old Testament?
Going there now.
When I was a pastor down in Texas, the second year I was there, I took a preaching theme for a year. And I encouraged my congregation to read through the Bible with me in a year. And we used a version of the Bible called the Daily Walk Study Bible. And the Daily Walk Study Bible is a neat way to do it. There are a number of ways you can do it. But the thing that's nice about that is that it really does walk you through. It gives you a kind of a roadmap of what you're going to be reading before you read. It offers you kind of a devotional thought after you finish reading. It gives you some nice background material as you're reading from time to time. And we did that. We worked our way from Genesis to Revelation, and I actually preached on Christmas on the story in Revelation about the woman and the dragon, which at least the early patristic writers understood as a reference to the birth of Jesus. So we had a lot of fun doing that. And if you've never read through the Old Testament, I would encourage you to do that. The Daily Walk Study Bible is a great tool that you can use to aid you, to kind of baby step you through that. Of course, I know that you've all read the book of Isaiah repeatedly because, you know, we've been studying that, but at least Tyler and I hope you have. Read through the Old Testament and don't do it just once and say, oh, I checked that off my bucket list. I read the Old Testament. I read the whole Bible. A lot of people do that. And if you don't read the Old Testament as frequently as you read the New Testament, then you will not see the connections as frequently as you're meant to. The more you read your Bible, the more you will see the connection. It's the same with anything, you know. You may have a favorite movie. I don't know. A lot of people like The Princess Bride, right?
Yes.
You can quote me passages out of The Princess Bride, word from word. You can paraphrase some passages from The Princess Bride. You might even say, you know, when this line occurred in The Princess Bride, I thought about this. And you'd be in conversation with someone and they could say, well, I never thought about that, but it really makes sense. What you're doing is you're doing intertextuality, but you're doing it with a movie. And the reason you can do it is because you've watched The Princess Bride so doggone many times that you can go, my name is Nego Montoya.
You go.
You killed my father. Prepare to die. You know, or you can say inconceivable, you know, and it's because you've paid that much attention to the text of the movie. If we paid that much attention to the text of the Old Testament, we would see what Matthew, helped by the Holy Spirit, and we get helped by the Holy Spirit too when we read the Old Testament, what he saw, much more of what he saw in Jesus as the fulfillment. Not abolishing the law, but fulfilling it. Not abolishing the words of the prophets, but fulfilling them. Not abolishing the wisdom of Solomon, but truly I tell you, someone greater than Solomon is standing right here in front of you. Jesus says all of those things. Why is he greater than the wisdom of Solomon? Are there echoes of the book of Proverbs in the teaching of Jesus? You betcha. Have you ever seen them? Probably not. If you read the book of Proverbs and then read the Gospel of Matthew, you might see some of them. You don't even have to read all the Old Testament and then read the Gospel of Matthew. You can read specific books of the Old Testament, then read the Gospel of Matthew after you read that book and see if you see an echo of that book in the Gospel of Matthew. The most Jewish book in the Old Testament, the book in the New Testament, sorry, the most Jewish book in the New Testament, the book most likely in the New Testament to use the Old Testament. That's what I wanted to say. I'm getting to that stage in my life where I don't always say what I want to say. And I realize when I'm in the middle of saying it, I'm not saying what I really want to say. Then you have to go back and say it all over again.
I have a question.
Carolyn has a question. Oh, good.
It just came to me. So I'm guessing if I have a Jewish friend, the Gospel of Matthew would be the best recommendation to give them to read if they were to ask. Would they see the same kind of things that we would see?
Okay. The second part of what
If
you
they
just
were
said just then,
open.
what you said just then is certainly true.
Yeah.
They would see many things, perhaps even things that you don't, if they were open to talking with you about the connections they saw. In terms of what you ask at first, would they see the same things? It depends upon their openness. Would it be the best gospel to recommend? It's one of the best. I mentioned briefly that John is, in the minds of many people, in my mind too, as Jewish as Matthew, just in a different way. And that's what I'll talk to you about next week. But I won't go into all of the detail about intertextuality because you know all of that now. But I want to talk with you about the signs in John's gospel. And I want to show you how those signs are opened up by understanding them in different ways, looking at different aspects of them. And one of the aspects that will really open up the meaning of a sign, the significance of a sign for you, is intertextuality. So the Gospel of John might be a book to recommend. Actually, Paul is a book to recommend if you want to. Any of the letters of Paul. Paul's a Jewish rabbi, and he'll use Old Testament quotations, give them Romans, and it will provoke them. It'll make them angry in chapter 2, and then in chapter 3 it will make them thoughtful. And in chapter 4, where Paul begins to talk about Abraham and the covenant with Abraham and how it is fully filled up in and through the life of Jesus, it will raise all of their hackles about Jesus being the Messiah or not. But if they're open to considering it, reading Paul's letter to the Romans would be a great recommendation.
Oh, well, so much for that. Thanks.
Bad.
Hey, Jim, Larry was trying, looks like he's
Okay.
still muted. He was
Thank you for
trying to-
being a moderator. I don't know why that's doing that. I do participants. And all right, hang on with me a second. Let me see here what's going on.
He mute himself?
Yeah, well, I read that Mike Pickett's book, you know, that's a very good book. Because I mean, his book,
He may have to agree when you unmute
his book is
up front.
what you're reading.
Okay, so he's come up out of the wilderness. So I have a question. When Matthew's primary audience, when this was written, was for the Jews of the day, right?
Matthew's primary audience is a really interesting question. Remember what the Great Commission is at the end of Matthew's Gospel. This is a commission he heard from Jesus. I believe, and I would say almost all New Testament scholars believe, the Great Commission is really the purpose statement of Matthew's Gospel. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And I'm with you always. So I think Matthew writes to probably a mixed community of Jews and Gentiles. Probably most New Testament scholars think in Antioch of Syria, perhaps. At least that's where Matthew may flee, as many early Christians did when persecution began in Jerusalem. And so that's where Matthew begins to collect all of these sayings together. Who finally edits them and where that gets published and where they're living, we don't know.
Well, the reason I was asking is that when you look at the other Gospels, when you look at Mark and you look at Luke, and granted, if you're saying John is also focused on the Jewish community as such, would you see the same intertextuality in Mark and Luke as you see in Matthew? Because the audiences that I understand those gentlemen wrote for were like more, or even they're called the Gentiles, who may not have that much understanding of the Old Testament.
It's a good question, Larry, and I'll try to answer it very simply. You have seen the two most Jewish documents as John and Matthew. New Testament scholars, including this one, would agree with you about that. Does it mean that intertextuality between the Gospel of Mark or between the Gospel of Luke and the Old Testament, that they don't betray intertextuality? No. Do they betray intertextuality to the same extent? Probably not to the same extent. But all of the kinds of intertextuality that we find that I've talked to you about tonight in relation to Matthew, you would find in Mark and Luke. And the question of extent would be about numbering things. And would that really tell you the truth that you're trying to get at about the audience of each of the Gospels? You're right that Mark seems to be writing for an audience, and Luke seems to be writing for an audience that is primarily a Gentile audience. But Rome, if that's where Mark is written, we know archaeologically that Rome included a great number of synagogues, and we know that the gospel probably reached the city of Rome after Pentecost, because Jews from the diaspora had traveled from Rome to the Feast of Pentecost and probably brought back the gospel with them, because nobody knows exactly when Christianity began in Rome. And, so there's all these things to consider and answer your question, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Let's see if I got everybody else unmuted here.
I think Gwen's still muted.
I know.
This was very good. Thank you.
I'm glad. I hope it's helpful and edifying. It builds up.
Thought-provoking. It gives you something new to learn and to read about.
Yeah, just really read your Old Testament. You would rejoice the heart of my Old Testament professor. He was really trying to show all of us New Testament seminarians, pastors about to be, that there was so much in the Old Testament that we needed to know.
We have to read all the begats.
Every single one.
Just look at the Christmas tree.
There's
No,
there's a retired professor at Fuller, John Goldengay, who wrote a book.
there you go.
Old Testament professor who wrote a book titled "Do We Need the New Testament?"
Wow.
He's very British, and I think the line is the first line of the book is, "Yeah, of course we do," but
Get your attention.
churches underemphasize the Old Testament. So, as an Old Testament scholar, he thought it'd be funny to title his book.
Yeah, I like it. I like that. You know, Dr. Paul Stevens at Regent College up in Canada, he always says, read 2 chapters of the Old Testament and 1 of
Yeah.
the New, and read a Psalms every day.
Yeah.
But you kind of get a balance because the Old Testament takes longer to get through anyway.
It's a very, very time-tested and very helpful way to read the Bible. Goldingay actually was a person that I knew when I was a doctoral student over in England, and he was there as well. And he taught originally at St. John's College in Nottingham, which is a theological college for Anglicans, and I was studying at the University of Nottingham. So he has just recently retired.
Well, thank you, Jim.
Oh, you're really welcome.
This is great. Yeah.
Good, good.
Thank you for
Come back next week. It won't be as technical, I guarantee you, but it will be hopefully even more meaningful. And like I told you, 6 ways in which you can think about connections between Matthew and the world behind the text. I'm going to show you 7 ways that we can connect the first story about the first sign in John's gospel, about water turning into wine. 7 ways that we can make connections that will help us dig more deeply into the meaning of that first sign and significance for us.
Well, I thought you were going
There's
to
my
say
teaser.
how we can actually make the wine from water. 7 ways.
I'm ready to learn.
Is that Tom Forstall?
Yeah.
You know,
Mad grapes.
you know, there's a God who created the atomic participles and the subatomic participles and the dark matter. And God knows how to manipulate all of that. And some people think, wow, it's just an incredible event. But think about it, you know, in our terms, we know more about science than they did, but we don't know how to change water into wine.
Yeah.
And good wine at that, right? Not just any wine, right?
Well, I've read through the whole Bible twice, and not that many years ago, but doesn't mean that I remember everything. So
That's right.
I need to do it again.
Yeah.
None of us do, and this is a real difference between their world and our world. You remember me telling you that their world was a world of speaking and hearing and remembering, because they didn't have many books. The estimate is that maybe 10% of the population is literate and can read. 90% can't. So it's all about what you hear, what you remember. Thank you, everybody. I will look forward to seeing you next Monday night, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.